Hello, readers. Natasha Lance Rogoff is an award-winning TV producer and documentary filmmaker. That includes serving as the lead producer for the Russian adaptation of Sesame Street, which she has just written a book about. It's called Muppets in Moscow, the unexpected, crazy, true story of making Sesame Street in Russia. And how about this? This book even has its own trailer.
Is to create a program that has never existed here before, which introduces children into the world of learning in a very joyful way and makes them understand that they can achieve anything that they want to in the future.
Какое-то такое первое прочтение ребенка.
Our kids have to share something. Let them share not Terminator, not Rambo, which is now the case, but Sesame Street.
Natasha, thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here talking to you, Trey.
It's my pleasure. And this is a fascinating story that you tell about really taking the idea of Sesame Street, which had been around for decades, and trying to create a product that was suitable for Russian children just after the breakup of the Soviet Union. I guess my first question for you, Natasha, is why did Sesame Street execs ask you to bring this great show to Russia?
I mean, this is something I've asked myself for the past 30 years, but I'm absolutely thrilled that they did because it was so different from anything else I had ever done in my life. And I had already been working in the Soviet Union for 10 years before two executives from Sesame Workshop, which was called Children's Television Workshop at the time, came to a screening of a documentary film that I had just finished, and it aired on PBS and also predicted the coup of 1991. So it was on the same night of the coup when the Soviet Empire collapsed. And it's a very dark film. So, I had embedded with conservative fascists for 2 years, the same people that tried to take over the government from Gorbachev at that time. And it's ironic now because one of the people that was involved in crushing the demonstration after after the protests erupted is the same military guy in charge of the war in Ukraine right now.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and he had served 6 years in prison after the 1991 demonstrations. When I saw that, I was just like, okay, this is horrific and surreal, just how history repeats itself. But at the time, these two executives came up and they were very charming. And I said to them, they said, could you help us in bring Sesame Street to Russia? We've been trying for a couple of years, and they had bipartisan support for the project, not appropriated funds, but a keen interest from the Congress to create a Russian version of Sesame Street so that the Muppets would be ambassadors to, bringing over idealistic values about tolerance and provide skills to children that they would need in order to thrive in a more open and markets-oriented society. So I asked, this was Gary Nell, who actually wrote the foreword to my book, who became the CEO of Sesame Street, a wonderful, wonderful person. and very charming. And he said, well, why don't you just talk to us? You can't say no to Elmo, can you?
Hmm.
And I was, although I thought it was nuts, like I was familiar with Russian comedy, and, kind of couldn't see the lighthearted, happy-go-lucky Muppets interacting with the pessimistic, angst-ridden, uh, Russian Muppets that would come to exist in the future.
Neither could
Original, yeah.
neither could a lot of Russians, as you were trying to float the idea in the beginning.
That is very true. Yes. But there was something about it that was so intriguing, and I did not grow up on Sesame Street because I was born, it aired in 1969, I think, and so I was already 9. But I was familiar with it, as everybody was in America, and I thought, this is kind of intriguing. Maybe this could, take hold there. And I was also aware that there wasn't that much for children at that time. The government really didn't have the money to support production. The film studios were black, great, giant, mammoth film studios that had produced world-renowned films for the past 70 years. Well, not 70, but I guess they started in 1920. Eisenstein, Potemkin, all these great films. And I just thought, well, maybe this would be a really wonderful gift that we could create with Russian artists. And then also, I knew many artists. They were my friends. I had been writing about underground culture for the past 10 years and making films about it. Underground rock musicians, the LGBTQ community, the theater people. And I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if I could offer opportunities to some of these people that had been denied opportunities under communism? Because this is all happening just a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, everybody really, there was really no free market yet. I mean, we in the West were all like, oh, tomorrow there's going to be a free market, but it was really a very, very difficult time, especially for artists. Because under the Soviet Union, they, those who didn't have their artwork banned, had usually some sort of subsidized sustenance. And now, there was nothing. So the idea of being able to build a team that would involve these people who I really loved, and then meeting new people, from other parts of the artistic community, it was like a daunting project, but also incredibly exciting.
So one of your bosses told you after this project was greenlit that getting an international version of Sesame Street off the ground in another country, which had happened in several other places up to this point, including Mexico, which we'll talk about here in just a second, but getting it started in another country was like a tripod with 3 legs. The first leg involved gauging interest and ability to produce such a children's show. The second leg is finding a worthwhile production partner. And the third is actually producing the series. Let's talk about that first leg for a second. That meant for you, when you arrived in Russia, dealing with that first challenge, which was get past the gatekeepers. Who exactly were the gatekeepers, and how did you ultimately get past?
It's a very good question. I mean, and Russia is unique because Sesame Street already had a number of international co-productions, mostly in Europe and in Mexico, of course. And usually the deals for the broadcast by the nonprofit, by Sesame Workshop, was done with the state broadcaster. So the equivalent of our public television, I guess, except it's a slightly different structure. And in the case of Russia, they had no cable at that point. There was basically two stations, budding stations, but we had already had cable. Nickelodeon existed by that time for quite some time in the US. So when I was initially hired to explore who would be our broadcast partner, my first reaction was, well, I really don't want to work with the state broadcaster, which is primarily the communist-run television studio. And my idea was that I would create a independent entity so that we could hire all kinds of independent artists to come together, and then we would make the show and eventually sell it to the TV station. And we did stick to that structure to some extent. Our team was an assembly of all kinds of independent people, freelancers for the most part. But we actually ended up doing the broadcast deal with the state broadcaster. So the process to getting there took another 5 years. So we made the whole show before we had the broadcast partner. And if as you're alluding to, we made many broadcast deals. And the first, the advisors we had, who were our confidants into what was going on in Russia's TV industry, were some of the bravest men I had met, who were not afraid to take on a lot of the communist bureaucrats who didn't want to give up power, not only inside the TV industry, but oligarchs running the new advertising industry, because there was no advertising industry before 1991. So, for your listeners, imagine that sentence. There was no advertising in the Soviet Union before 1991.
Mm-hmm.
Well, once they opened Pandora's box, oh, it was frightening, because there was a lot of money at that time, because Western companies were coming in, flooding in to sell products in this newly opened post-communist market. And we were there with our puppet show, walking around, meeting people and proposing to put this on the air, obviously not having commercials in the body of the show, because Sesame Street is a nonprofit. And so we don't do that. And we didn't do that on public television and didn't do that internationally. But we did recognize that, we may have a very popular show on our hands if we are able ever to get it off the ground. So the first people that we started working with, one was Vlad Listyev, who was he hosted a talk show and also a Russian version of Jeopardy. He was a very versatile, brilliant man who was a friend of my business partner, Leonid Zygalski. So he quietly tried to help us. And he worked in the same studio where we were meeting with all these people. And he was murdered when he left the studio one evening, and shot in front of his house.
Incredibly tragic. Why was he murdered?
Nobody really knows to this day. There are 120 judicial files, and it's still an unsolved case. So, I mean, there were many rumors about it, and generally people thought that it had something to do with a moratorium on advertising that he was instituting shortly before his death. And people in power knew about that, and he was trying to clean up the TV industry because people were making so much money, but there wasn't enough money to pay for production. So he was trying to rectify that situation. But there are a number of other people who, he wasn't afraid to take on people and fight corruption. And he is a much loved man by, all over the former Soviet Union.
So finding Russian funding to pair with the money coming in from the US to help pay for this show was a challenge, to say the least. The first hope nearly died in a car bombing, which exposed to you guys that you were about to take money from a gangster. Another failed attempt included a guy who considered himself the Russian Sausage King. I'd love to meet that guy, at least for just a couple minutes.
I'm not sure you want to meet him.
Maybe just like watch him on a TV screen or something for a few minutes, making his sausage. Eventually, you met a woman named Irina Borisova. Who was she, and what impressed you about her during y'all's first meeting?
Irina Borisova is how that's pronounced.
Thank you. You're going to have to correct me throughout this conversation, because I'm going to get a lot of these pronunciations wrong, including whatever it was that Sesame Street was translated to in Russia.
Улица Sesame.
There you go.
Yeah, no, but you'll get it. And Irina was quite a character. So stunning, so elegant, super smart, and warm but tough at the same time. And of course, the idea of, my counterpart would be a woman, I just had never thought that, because Russia, especially in the TV industry, is so sexist and so patriarchal. And it still is. I whenever I say this, I always say a caveat, which is that Russia also had policies that were so progressive already from 1920s related to women's rights. So it's a very schizophrenic country, because they have these rights, but they still want women to wear skirts. So of course Irina did wear skirts and she looked lovely. And she was just extremely passionate about this. She had an 8-year-old daughter. She told me, she said, I'm not doing this. I do have a company. I have one of the largest, advertising companies, and the only company run by a woman in the former Soviet Union. But I'm doing this for my daughter. And I believe that our country needs this, and this show can make a difference.
So music is obviously a huge part of Sesame Street. Why was convincing the Russians to diversify the show's music such a tough subject?
I would say that the obstacles that we faced in creating original music for Улица Sesame related a lot to the fact that it was new and different, and it involved a generational battle between older, people who had grown up in the Soviet Union, and younger children who had also grown up in the Soviet Union, but had already had a great deal more freedom in the 1980s from Glasnost, and had different expectations. So when we assembled the first team, we had people that were from the TV station, for the most part, the state-run TV station, TV professionals who had come from the old world. And the person who was selected to be the music director, Katya Kamalkova, was a very accomplished pianist and composer, and very proud of her nation's music. She said to us, why would we have anything other than classical music in our shows when we have such a renowned music tradition? Why don't we highlight something that's really wonderful about our past, especially when so much of our past is being challenged and destroyed and trampled on? Let's hold this piece up. And it made sense. But also, Sesame Street as a show is, as you said, known for its innovative, diverse music. And also, one of my main reasons for wanting to make this show in Russia was to, essentially bring in people I knew, music artists who I thought they were incredibly talented, and they hadn't had opportunities in the past. So we were at real loggerheads, and that went on for, a couple months. And I understood where she was coming from, because there is a wonderful Russian animation that is, you know, hand-drawn cell animation, absolutely artistically amazing. And a lot of it uses classical music, and that's fine. You know, it's part of their tradition. So I understood where she was coming from, and how what I was suggesting was different.
What ultimately allowed for some sort of agreement or some sort of meeting in the middle with regards to what the Russians were okay with on the show?
Well, in the case of music, um, I was pretty dogged, and I just wanted her to meet some of the you know, formerly banned musicians.
Hmm.
I didn't know what was going to happen, and you know, what my colleague, and a very dear friend from the 1980s, had offered to speak with her, and he also had criticized me for not for expecting things to change too fast, and not really being sensitive to where she was coming from and what was her worldview. So when these two people met, Katya and Sasha, and they hit it off like a house on fire, they had children the same age. And also, my friend had been classically, you know, trained as a classical musician originally. So they just hit it off and were able to find common ground. And from then on, Katya became such an advocate of all the new musicians, younger, you know, older. We just had amazing music on the show. It surpassed any expectation I had for what it could be.
What a great earnest thought that your friend, who obviously had a lot to gain by being included in this project, offered up there. Something that may have, in theory, worked against him in trying to get you to see the other side. But I mean, that sort of input is incredibly valuable as you are working your way through something so new like that, and really trying to figure out why somebody else may feel completely differently from what the vision is that you're trying to make happen.
Yeah, I think the you know, the generosity that was felt on the you know, in the production office and on the set as our team ballooned to, you know, more than 400 artists
Hmm.
was extraordinary. And you know, when the longtime Sesame Street veterans came to the set in Moscow, Lisa Simon, who was one of the directors of Sesame Street, and Luis Santiero, who's a writer of Sesame Street, they would come to that set and they all said, this set has the same feeling of the early days of Sesame Street, you know, when we were working with Jim Henson and creating, you know, as we went along, and everybody was working together, and there was really not as much. There was, well, there was very limited hierarchy, which is, I think, traditionally how a lot of women run companies. But when I was running the show, I really tried to do that. I wanted everybody to feel that they could share their opinions, and that it was an inclusive environment, and that we had at least half of the jobs were, you know, high key jobs were filled by women, which we did, and that was amazing too.
So eventually, y'all are far enough along with this that the Russian production team travels to New York City to go through a sort of Sesame Street boot camp with those who put on the show in the US, really teaching them the ropes. I guess it's worth letting people know at this point that part of the plan for Russian Sesame Street involved original programming, but original programming originating from Russia that's specific to the Russian audience. But part of it involved dubbing segments from the original show. Of course, that means the American kids who are acting in that episode would be seen in Russia. Why was the subject of African-American child actors such a point of contention for the Russians, and how was this ultimately resolved?
When the Russian team came to New York City and met with the head of research, Dr. Valery Lovelace, um, there was a discussion about racism in America. And I think that the creative team that came to the U.S. Wasn't really seeing race in the same way that we see race. So they have something like 150, or I think 152 different nationalities across the former Soviet Union. And it is true that people at that time would often, white Russians would use the terms, some people would, of Chornya, which means blacks, to describe Kazakhs or Chechens. And there was a great deal of racism in the Soviet Union, but at the same time, the concept of communism, which was brotherly socialist love and uplifting everybody and providing education for everybody, that was the mantra of the ideology in the society for 70 years. But I think that Dr. Lovelace was thinking about race in terms of racism in America, and the Russians, their concept of race, they didn't really use that word, but it was just nationalities, which relates to a regional area, basically. So they were sort of talking at cross purposes, and Dr. Lovelace, this was during a period of time at the workshop when there was a theme. Each season would have a new theme, and that particular year, it was a focus on addressing racism in American society and how to try to create a greater understanding and greater harmony for young children relating to race. So Dr. Lovelace was talking about that, but the reaction of the Russian team was like, well, we don't have any blacks in our country, because even though they use black for Kazakh, she was talking about African American blacks. And so the linguistic differences didn't allow the Russian team to connect with it. They thought she was just talking about something that had nothing to do with them. And there wasn't enough of I think, advanced preparation on my part with the research team to try to say, oh, let's frame the discussion so it also brings in the many nationalities in the former Soviet Union, and then let's get the Russian team to talk about that too. So, this was a 1 hour or 1.5 hour discussion. So there were some things lost in translation, I would say. And when you ask about the resolution, this all changed when the Russian creative team went with the director of research up to Harlem to participate in a research testing of Sesame Street programs, of the American programs. And I think for many of the Russians, this was the first time in their life they had ever been in the same room playing with Black children. And it was a really moving experience, seeing how they bonded with the different kids, and each person was, they set up a buddy system, and then the children were playing with Mr. Potato Head and showing the Russians how to build with it, and they'd never seen the toy before, and after this experience, somehow it became a much broader discussion about how important it was for the show to be inclusive. So I in that case, I was really kind of holding back and stepping back and allowing the process to take hold of people emotionally and have them be able to connect as human beings across cultures. And it was, I think if you talk to my Russian colleagues now, for them, that day is probably their favorite day in the production process.
You and the Sesame Street team were doing a good job of nudging before it was fashionable to nudge.
I think that Sesame Street started, long ago, and they were the first.
So chapter 12 starts with this paragraph, quote, Sesame Street uses a proprietary research-based approach to creating children's television that was developed by the show's original creators. The cornerstone of this model is the curriculum workshop, which involves bringing child education experts together with TV professionals to develop specific educational goals that also reflect the culture and values in the countries where the show is being produced. You, Natasha, gathered Russian educators and academics at a Sesame Street workshop seminar to determine these things. What did they decide were the culture and values worth showcasing to Russian children?
Well, this curriculum seminar, which is the cornerstone of every international co-production, was actually organized by the director of research, Dr. Anna Genina, and our creative team was part of that workshop because we bring together education experts and the creative team, producing team. And it was a very intense 3 days with heated discussions about values. And I would say one of the most poignant points that was made by one of the educators who was doubtful about our ability to come up with ways to teach next generations about openness is he said, you're tasking us with coming up with ideas we should teach children in the future to help them thrive in an open society, and we don't know what an open society looks like. So how are we going to do this? And then the American director of international research, Shari Cole, encouraged him to stay, not to leave, because he was going to leave. He just said, I'm not going to stay. This is ridiculous. We'll never do this. And she said, please, just give it a chance. And he stayed. And by the end of the curriculum seminar, he was absolutely shocked and pleased by the consensus that we did reach. But before we got to that point, there was a great deal of discussion around all kinds of issues. For example, how do you teach children about markets? And everybody was throwing around ideas. So I suggested, well, what about writing a scenario where children run a lemonade stand? And, that could teach counting and team building skills, and also about, business to some extent for little kids. And explained, we do this in America. This is something that's very common. And the group just looked at me, with horror, like, you can't have children selling things on the street. That's shameful. And the only people that do that are criminals. And I realized that, I said this and I realized, oh yeah, that's true. Just a couple of years earlier, the only people selling stuff on the street were mafia. And if you did do that, you would basically be put in jail for speculation. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me turn this off. So that was eye-opening for me. And there were a number of areas, conversations that we had. Another was about inclusivity. And as part of the process, we were talking about gender issues, all kinds of progressive ideas that are part of an open society. And when we showed a clip of a little boy in a wheelchair, which has a cute upbeat song in the background where he's riding in his wheelchair, flying a kite, and there's the song, says, "Me and my chair, we go everywhere." And then the clip finished, and one man stands up and says, "You shouldn't show children in a wheelchair on the TV show." And I thought, well, why not? You know, I mean, this totally, this was unexpected. I mean, I just did not think this one would be a problem. And so then someone else says that, you know, you Americans, you don't understand that we don't want to show children in wheelchairs on our TV show, on our Sesame Street TV show, because most children will never ever get a wheelchair. That the state of health currently and the poverty situation, that, you know, these children are trapped in their beds, and then they're going to see another child with a wheelchair on TV and they'll never get one. That'll just make them feel sad. Why not just not show it? So, you know, I thought that is a perspective I, you know, hadn't considered. And obviously, you know, all of these issues are not things that I really came in contact with making documentaries and being somebody on the outside, you know, covering politics and economics and, you know, even underground music. And so this whole experience of working with a team and talking about children was such a deep dive into Russian culture that I never had. And I speak Russian. I had already been there 10 years. And yet I was having these eye-opening experiences that were, you know, incredibly moving. And, you know, after this woman said that, then another woman stood up and said, you know, I come from this town called, this region called Chuvash that stretches from the Volga to Siberia. And we have many children with, she said, we have many nenormalnie дети, not normal children, which was the word that was used over and over again for disabled children, quote unquote. And so she said, you know, I work with these children every day and they long to play with normal children. They, you know, why don't we write scenarios where they're seen as a valuable part of society? And, you know, let's change let's change the way we see these children. And, you know, after she finished speaking, I looked around, and the people that had spoken earlier about not including disabled children in the show were like shifting in their seats uncomfortably. And then some of the people had started, you could see that they were crying. And I realized in that moment that I was losing it too. And that I too was like, this was, you know, such a moment of transition to see this entire group of people, you know, it was like the whole place was opening up itself, like in a room. You could see the transition happening. And, you know, I always say that Ludmila, the woman from Chuvash, the special needs teacher, that she was like an angel that had descended into the room and mesmerized everybody. And from then on, you know, the discussion about inclusivity changed as well. So we had, you know, at the time of auditioning, we were looking for children from, you know, all from a very diverse group of children.
I'm assuming that most people watching and listening right now can picture what the American Sesame Street neighborhood looks like, something that emulates a neighborhood that you could find in and around New York City. What were some of the most important details in putting together the set for the Russian Sesame Street neighborhood?
Well, the U.S. Neighborhood is, you know, based on an urban setting, Harlem setting. But all the international Sesame Street co-productions have a public place where people can gather. And so in Mexico, it's a plaza. In Norway, it's a train station. in South Africa, it's a marketplace.
Hmm.
So we knew that we were looking for something that was, some place that was going to be an open area that neighbors could interact in, and you could have a community. But the set designer had a real dilemma because she wasn't sure what the set should reflect. Should it reflect pre-revolutionary Russia? Should it reflect Russia's recent Soviet past? Or should it be something new that was completely unknown, that maybe they couldn't even conceive of what it would be yet? So that was frustrating to her to try to figure that out. And it also had to be a set that would appeal to the entire former Soviet Union across 11 time zones, because that's where the show would be broadcast. So eventually the research director, Anna Genino, was very helpful with this, and she proposed a courtyard, a traditional both pre-revolutionary and Soviet courtyard that is surrounded by apartment buildings, blocks of apartment buildings, whether they're neoclassical or Soviet, prefab concrete that you see across Eastern Europe and, in Soviet, in post countries. So that was great. And then the idea was that they would take this courtyard and then make it a friendlier, kinder place. Mm. So that the other challenge was that the courtyard had to also be, the set had to be realistic, because Sesame Street's way of working is that the children should be in a real life environment, not a fantastical environment with, where you could solve problems with magic and fairy godmothers. And, you should learn how to have a problem and solve that problem, with your by yourself or with guidance from adults, and model that. But the Russian creative team said, well, if our courtyard is going to be realistic, then we should have a rusty car in it, garbage all over the place. There should be glass everywhere, and neighbors should report on their neighbors to the KGB. So that was another challenge of how to make it, realistic, but also someplace you'd want your children to play. But what they ended up, the group ended up creating, the set was created by Masha Rabasova, who was a brilliant theater set designer, was absolutely exquisite, down to a giant 40-foot oak tree, and houses that were traditional dachas, so wooden country style, very modest homes, and the brick architecture that is prevalent in pre-revolutionary Russia. And then the set designer hand painted a scrim, which a backdrop that went the full length of the studio, and it had architectural elements from all different periods of Soviet history and churches. So it looked like this, kind of like a Where's Waldo, a Russian Where's Waldo of architecture. It was absolutely beautiful.
Why was casting the Russian child actors so damn sad, and what ultimately turned the tide here?
Well, the auditions for the show are probably my favorite part of any production, because I get to hear children sing, and that's absolutely lovely. So when we went into the auditions, which were run by the chief director and the supervising producer, and they asked me to kind of stay in the background because they didn't want to have an American there. And they just said, why don't you just hang back? Because most of these families, really have never met an American in their life. So let's just keep it calm here. And so when the children were separated and they came in one at a time, So they didn't hear what the other children were singing. And when the first little boy came in, he sang a World War II song. The planet is burning. He drops to an alto. The fire is, whatever. I can't remember the lyrics now, but it was so morose. And I thought, okay, this is really weird for a children's comedy show, but what the hell? So then the director, tells him good job, and he leaves. And then the next child comes in, a little girl with, blonde pigtails and blue eyes, and she sings with her little soprano voice a song called Katusha, which is all about a woman who's singing about her loved one who's gone off to the front. And this went on for the rest of the morning, with children coming in and singing these, morose songs about death, loss, and war. And I just thought, wow, this is not what I expected. I expected like the Itsy Bitsy Spider or Old MacDonald's Have a Farm. And so at lunchtime, when I left with the director, I was like, what's going on here? Hello, I don't understand. And he just looked confused, and he said, what are you talking about? These are songs that bring our children comfort. They sing these songs with their grandmothers, and you call them sad and morose, but you have to think of them as lyrical and poetic. And our children read poetry from a young age with their grandmothers, and they are used to sadness in their music and in their lives. So, that was very sobering. And in the context of, what's going on today in Russia and in Ukraine, I take this to heart, and I think about how, what we all experienced together in Russia in the 1990s reflects values that are still present today and impacting their own society and the world.
The final challenge that we're going to discuss has to do with the making of the Russian Muppets themselves. Why was something as seemingly trivial as color even a sticking point in this regard?
Well, let's see. We had the discussion about the development of the Muppets went on for, I think, about 4 or 5 months.
It took,
and
it was brought up again and again throughout this book, and there was finally a resolve, I want to say, within the last like 60 to 70 pages.
Yes. The Russians are a very artistic people with wonderful ideas, and I say it just took a long time to figure out, how we were going to come up with the design for the new 3 Slavic Muppets that would reflect everything that they hoped their Muppets would reflect. And perhaps one of the challenges was that, everybody had such high expectations for the show and what it could achieve. And that really, set a high bar, so that, it was very hard to make everybody happy, but we really wanted to try. So that's why it took so long. But in the process, initially the team didn't want the Muppets at all. They wanted to use their own hard wooden puppets. And the first head writer said, we have our own puppet tradition dating back to the 16th century, and we don't need your Muppets. And in the book, I go into this in great detail, because a lot of this material I had chronicled on videotape, because I just couldn't believe what people were saying. They wanted to use they had scientific reasons why the Muppets were not Russian, compared to their own puppets. And I won't get into it now, but it was fascinating. And then on top of that, the when it got to coming up with the idea about the color for the Muppets, in one writers meeting, the puppet, one of the writers said, well, the puppet can't be blue because blue means goluboy in Russian, and that means gay, and people will think the puppet's gay. And the visiting as if that's something bad, and then the head writer who was over visiting from the American show, Luis Santiero, he just quickly turns around and says, that Muppets don't really have sex.
They don't,
and a sexual identity or something.
They don't have biological sex. They're Muppets.
Yeah. Anyway, he won a lot of points from the younger writers for taking that older writer down, who was just like saying ridiculous, just awful stuff. But then there's a fascinating discussion in the book about choosing the colors of the three Muppets once the design was pretty much established. And it wasn't like the situation that happened in Mexico when I was the producer there, where the wife of the Mexican executive producer walked in and said, I think, the Muppet character should be pink. And then the character was pink, and that was it. And in this case, the entire team sat down and had to consult the 100-year-old treatise by Vasily Kandinsky, the famous artist who had written on the theory of color and how emotions carry, different colors carry different emotions. And we had to analyze all of this to make sure that the puppets would have the right colors in order for children to feel the right emotions associated with those puppets. So I love this. I mean, I have to say, this is why I love working in Russia for so many years, and I stayed there for so many years. The level of abstraction and poetry is so seductive in this culture. And yes, they did. They consulted Kandinsky to come up with their colors for their Muppets.
So you and your team maneuvered through all the things we just talked about and things that you have no control over, from tragic murders to the Russian military overtaking your business offices while you were on a mini honeymoon, forcing you to shorten that mini honeymoon that much more. By the way, love the romantic story that was woven within these pages, including the engagement story. At one point, you, while pregnant, had to sneak money into Russia in your bra. There is a presidential election going on during this time, but ultimately you do get to the finish line. And that first episode airs in October of 1996, I believe. What was it like getting to that point?
I think none of us knew if we would ever succeed at any point. We thought the production would be shut down almost every month. And, as you've seen in the book, you've mentioned some of the obstacles. It was just a complete roller coaster ride, and often terrifying because of the violence in the country. So, when finally the broadcast deal came through, which, thanks with the help of an incredible team at Sesame Street in the US and the Russian broadcasters, who all came together to set up some sort of very complex interlocking deal. I was already very emotional because I had just given birth, but really I cried. I mean, it was unbelievable. And, to be able to share that with the team of people that had sacrificed so much and worked so hard and with such passion to bring Улица Sesame to the post-Soviet Union, to millions of children, was an incredible feeling.
So the show. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I'm very, very proud of what we all achieved together.
So the show ends up running from 1996 to 2010. This is my last question, by the way. What is the lasting legacy of that show?
I have to say that as I watch the Russian young people in their late 20s and 30s now marching out of Russia and opposing the war, I think about how those are children who grew up on Ulica Sesame. And I also think about, on the other side in Ukraine, the same age group, the same cohort that's fighting for freedom and self-determination now, that they too are children of Ulica Sesame. And I think that's the legacy of our show in working with this team of Moscow artists to bring idealistic values to a country. And I know one day this war will end and the Russians who left will come back. And I hope there will be peace in Ukraine.
Well put. She is Natasha Lance Rogoff. The new book is an excellent one. It's called Muppets in Moscow, the unexpected, crazy, true story of making Sesame Street in Russia. Natasha, thank you so much for the time today, and thank you so much for this book.
Thank you so much, Trey. I really enjoyed talking with you. You asked great questions. It was really fun.
Thank you. Pleasure's all
Take
mine.
care.
Hopefully this isn't the last time.
Look forward to it.
Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. And thanks to you for hanging out. You can watch, listen, learn, and connect for free at booksonpod.com. For Books on Pod, I'm Trey Elling. Good day.